They say it takes a village to raise a child, and I believe also a young adult. In my family, my mother was a primary caregiver, and she gave me a love of music and of nature, but there were some missing pieces in my life, and I found four wonderful women who mentored me, who taught me some other living skills and gave me the love that I needed in times that were difficult. My Aunt Doris. For my first 3 years, my parents and I lived with my widowed grandfather and my Aunt Doris. She was single at the time. Um, she she was my godmother, and she told me that she always considered me and my siblings her own children. After my grandfather died, my parents bought a house in Connecticut, and Dory moved on to New York City to become an executive secretary. But she spent many weekends with us. It was always very exciting when Dory came. There was usually some chocolate hidden in her suitcase. On Saturday mornings, we'd all pile into her bed for much laughter and giggling and storytelling. I always felt as though she valued what I said and was very supportive, and I felt like I could talk to her about anything. Dory was the fun aunt. She took me to dude ranches and I learned horseback riding. We went swimming and to movies and played board games. She was always with us at Christmas time, and Dory and I were as excited as little kids about decorating the Christmas tree. She always wore beautiful clothes and looked very glamorous. Her vacations took her to Europe. Many times we went down to New York and saw her off as she boarded her ocean liner. She came back after visiting family in Switzerland and seeing Europe with a suitcase covered with stickers from exotic places and many happy stories. It gave me a feeling that there is a big world beyond suburban lily-white Connecticut. She and my father were the first generation born in the United States, and she was very proud of her Swiss heritage. So I learned much about Swiss culture and family from her. I learned from her also that a loving relationship can include some differences. She was always a very traditional Republican, but we always agreed to disagree. And in fact, she was even glad to hear of some of my political doings, like meeting Bernie Sanders. She also was a very traditional Protestant, but she enjoyed hearing about the services I led, and I always sent her a transcript of them. At midlife, she married and moved out to Santa Barbara, and I went out to visit several times and had a wonderful visit. Unfortunately, she passed away last fall just before her 98th birthday, and this is the first service I won't be able to share with her. The next story is about my great-grandmother, Ma. This is her necklace that I'm proudly wearing. Ma was the Lydia whose family took in Sarah, who was also deaf, so they never really were able to get her whole story. Lydia Phillips Clayton was my great-grandmother, my mother's father's mother. I always called her Ma. At a very young age, she married a Civil War veteran who was much older than she was, but they had a long and happy marriage, but unfortunately they tragically lost 2 children. She always worked as a milliner and was an excellent seamstress. When I knew her, she lived with my grandparents, Grandma and Fafa, in New Jersey. We often went to visit, and I can remember as a young child going down what seemed like a very, very long hallway to her sitting room upstairs, and I'd sit in her lap in a rocking chair, and she'd tell me stories about her life and her childhood. My grandparents decided to move to Tucson when they retired, and they took Ma with her. They found a house that had a guest cottage behind it, which is where Ma lived. Very soon after that, my parents decided to move out to Tucson too. My father had been stationed there during the war at Davis-Monthan Air Base, and he taught celestial navigation to pilots. They had many happy memories of their time in Tucson, and when they were first married, my mother had joined my father out there, so they're very eager to move back. My family was often at Grandma and Fafa's for Sunday dinner and for visits. I loved going to visit Ma in her little cottage. It had a bed at one end, a picture on the wall of her husband in a Civil War uniform, and a kitchenette and bathroom at the other end. A table sat by the window, and in front of the table was her rocking chair. Again, she told me many stories and taught me the basics of how to sew. And sewing has become a lifelong passion for me. And although she told family stories, she never did talk at all about whether she had Native American ancestry. We knew she didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to be teased about it. But my grandfather said that there was Native American ancestry. And I think something must have rubbed off on me because I've always had a great interest in Native American culture. We lived in Tucson for my second grade year. This was a time when my parents were in a lot of turmoil because my father was not able to find the job he liked. He had been trained in installing elevators and engineering, and in Tucson there were mostly one-story buildings. As a stopgap, he worked at my grandfather's toy store. Well, you can imagine having a grandfather with a toy store. And so finally, I think my parents went through a very, very painful period, and my father decided to drive back east to find us a house to live there. During that summer, I imagined to give my mother a break. I was often invited to spend the night at Ma's cottage. And this was a very special treat to stay there and be showered with her love, because I really felt very unconditional love from her. And she also gave me the gift of knowing how to sew. After we moved back to Connecticut, she died a few months later. Vivian Rosenberg. When Bob and I were first married, we lived in New York, upstate New York, in Hudson. And he was working as a social worker at a school for delinquent girls. We were very active in the peace movement there because this was during the Vietnam War. Wednesday at noontime, we held vigils, and this is where I met Vivian and Irving Rosenberg. They were kind of hippies before their time. They were old enough to be our parents with kids about our age, but they were organic farmers and pacifists and very, very active in the peace movement. Irving had been in the war working on a hospital train in Europe, so he saw a lot of the horrors of war. If anybody heckled us on a vigil line, he'd pull out his dog tags from the army and wave them in their face. He also, unfortunately, managed to undergo a lot of microaggression that was anti-Semitic at the place where he worked, so he was very cynical about the human race. Vivian, on the other hand, always believed in the goodness of people. She had a strong background in the civil rights movement and the peace movement, and I understand she either studied at NYU with William E. Du Bois or was exposed to his speeches. She also wrote a book about Ray Stannard Baker, who was an early muckraking journalist. Vivian really believed if you're patient and gently persuade people of your beliefs, they will see the way. If you take part in enough vigils, write enough letters, do enough campaigning, engage in dialogue, people will really see the light. They had a very modest home that was filled with friends and music. If anyone was in need, Vivian always managed to find some money or a couch to sleep on for the person. She loved her garden, and she also loved preparing food from her garden. She always had a very angelic look on her face when she was cooking. I had never thought of having a garden before I knew Vivian, but she made me want one, and she also taught me not to worry too much about the weeds. I remember one time sitting at her kitchen table, and she said, "Oh, look, there's a sunset that shouldn't be missed." After Robbie was born, they were kind of surrogate grandparents to Rob, and Vivian was very supportive of breastfeeding. We left Hudson a year or so after that, but we've always stayed in touch with them, and I'm sorry to say that they're both now gone, and I really miss them. While we lived in Hudson, New York, I became friends with Juanita Carr when I was volunteering at the Youth Recreation Center in Hudson's African American neighborhood. She was a strikingly beautiful African American woman in her 40s. I can barely begin to imagine all of the challenges she faced because she was a divorced mother with 11 bright and lively kids, and they lived in a very small house and had very little money. But she was truly the mother of everybody in the neighborhood. One of her daughter's friends became pregnant and was thrown out of the house, so Juanita took her in. And it turned out the girl didn't make it to the hospital and the baby was born in Juanita's living room. When I became pregnant with Rob, I knew I wanted a baby very much, but I didn't know very much about babies. And I knew I wanted a different model for parenting than the way I had been raised. Juanita took me under her wing and let me practice with her baby grandson, Corey. I've learned so many things from her. I learned that love is the most important thing you can give a child, and there's always enough love to go around. To trust your child, listen to your baby. Your baby will tell you what he needs. As your children grow older, teach them good common sense and then trust them. Her kids pretty much had the run of Hudson and managed to stay out of trouble. I remember one time I was visiting and said that I'd heard Pete Seeger's sloop Clearwater was coming to town and we were going to go see it that night. And one of the kids said, "Oh, you mean that old boat that's coming under the bridge?" She was very proud of all the things that her children taught her. One time she went to an auction where the contents of an old hotel was being sold. Her kids said to her, "Mom, buy the fire extinguishers." She thought, fire extinguishers? So she bought a big bunch of fire extinguishers for $1 apiece. Her kids turned them around and sold them for scrap copper at $3 a piece. When Rob was born, the first thing Bob did after he left the hospital was go to Juanita's house to tell her the news. When Rob and I got home, she came to visit. And you would think she had never seen a baby. She was so excited to see him. When we needed a babysitter, we always had Juanita's daughter take care of Rob, but all of the kids would play with him, and she said they would airplane him around the room until they laughed so hard she made them stop. A little bit after that, we left Hudson and went on to other things, and I'm sorry that I lost touch with her. She didn't have a phone, so the way to get in touch was to show up at her doorstep. One time we did go back to Hudson to visit the Rosenbergs, and we did find Juanita at home, and so she got to meet Lorian as well. And our lives got busy, and I'm just really sorry I lost contact with her because she was such an important person to me that I just loved her big, loving heart and her wonderful spirit of mothering and her goodness and her acceptance. So all of these women were very important to me in different ways that I learned to accept unconditional love. I learned to sew. I learned how to be a peace activist. I learned how to be a mother, and I'm grateful to all of them. And I'd like to close with a quotation from Maya Angelou. In order to be a mentor, and an effective one must care. You must care. You don't have to know how many square miles are in Idaho. You don't need to know what is the chemical makeup of chemistry or of blood or water. Know what you know and care about the person. Care about what you know and care about the person you're sharing with. May it be so.